In this episode, we explore the real-life consequences of restrictive abortion laws in post-Roe America, starting with the tragic story of Amber Thurman, a young mother whose death highlights the deadly impact of Georgia's Life Act. These laws go beyond limiting access to abortion. They create dangerous delays in medical care, leave doctors uncertain, and put all pregnant women at risk. Join us as we uncover how these bans are reshaping healthcare, endangering lives, and challenging women's rights across the nation.
Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling a tough one. How restrictive abortion bans are impacting maternal health care, and especially in a post-Roe America. You know, we've gotten a ton of really in-depth articles, personal accounts, and even some legal analyses. So we've got a lot to unpack.
Yeah, and it's definitely a hot-button issue with some very, very strong opinions all over the place. But you know what we're going to do is cut through the noise, help you understand exactly how complex this issue is. You know, focusing on what's actually happening out there in the real world.
Exactly. It's about, connecting all these legal changes to what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah.
So, okay, to set the stage for everybody, Roe v. Wade, the landmark decision that protected abortion rights for, almost 50 years, was overturned in 2022. And that really opened the floodgates for states like Georgia to enact what a lot of people are calling heartbeat bills.
And basically these bills ban abortion after about 6 weeks of pregnancy. Which is often before a lot of women even know that they're pregnant. And in Georgia specifically, they're calling it the Life Act, although the irony of that name will become very clear as we get into Amber's story.
Yeah, it's definitely a loaded term given what we're about to talk about. So after Roe was overturned, Amber found herself facing a really, really difficult decision. She was a 28-year-old single mom working as a medical assistant. She already had a 6-year-old son. And then she finds out she's pregnant with twins.
And because of this new law in Georgia, her options were really limited. She wanted to have an abortion, but with that 6-week ban, she had to travel out of state to North Carolina to get care.
And from what we read in that ProPublica article, even getting an appointment in North Carolina wasn't easy. It sounds like there was a huge influx of patients coming in from all these other states where abortion was either completely banned or super restricted.
Yeah.
So because of all these scheduling delays, she couldn't get a surgical abortion, which is what she wanted originally.
So Amber ended up going with a chemical abortion, which means taking 2 different medications. And it's a safe method, especially early in pregnancy, but it's not without its risks, as we unfortunately see in Amber's case.
So after she takes the medications, she starts experiencing some really, really bad cramping and bleeding, which, isn't that uncommon? But then a few days later, things take a really terrifying turn. She starts vomiting blood and she ends up passing out at home. And her boyfriend immediately calls 911.
And she's rushed to Piedmont Henry Hospital in Georgia, where the doctors diagnose her with sepsis. And they suspected that it was caused by retained fetal tissue, which is a possible complication of both surgical and chemical abortions.
And so this is where the impact of that Life Act comes in. The doctors knew that the best way to treat her sepsis was to do a D&C, which is a procedure to remove that tissue. But because of that abortion ban, they hesitated.
And that hesitation comes down to how unclear that law is. It technically allows exceptions to save the mother's life, but it doesn't clearly define what a life-threatening situation actually is.
So it puts the doctors in this impossible position. They're afraid that if they perform the D&C, it could be interpreted as an illegal abortion, even if it's necessary to save the woman's life.
Exactly. It's this chilling effect where doctors are more worried about legal trouble than they are about giving the best possible medical care. And what makes it even more tragic is that somebody actually predicted this exact situation.
You're talking about Dr. Melissa Kotka,
right?
The OBGYN, who testified before Georgia lawmakers when they were debating that heartbeat bill back in 2019.
Yes, she warned them that this law would basically make doctors scared and uncertain, and that would lead to delays in treatment that would end up hurting women. And she even said that doctors would feel like they had to wait for higher blood pressure, a higher fever, for women to bleed even more before they could step in, just so that they knew they were in the clear legally.
And her prediction, unfortunately, became Amber's reality.
Her condition kept getting worse. She spent almost 20 hours in the hospital in excruciating pain. And her sepsis progressed to a really severe level and her organs started to fail. And it was only when it was completely obvious that she was in immediate danger that the doctors finally did the D&C.
But by then it was too late. Amber died on the operating table from septic shock, and it was directly related to that retained tissue. And the Georgia Maternal Mortality Review Committee later said that her death was completely preventable.
And they said straight up that the delay in getting that D&C led to her death, and that it was all a result of that chilling effect from the state's abortion ban.
And that's where we start to see how big this issue really is. It's not just about limiting access to abortion.
Yeah.
It's about how these laws make people confused and scared and put women's lives in danger.
You got it. It really makes you question if these laws are actually about protecting life, or if they're really just putting women in more danger. And as we'll see, Amber's case is definitely not the only one. And the really troubling thing is Amber's story isn't isolated. Like, the Associated Press did a huge investigation back in 2024, and they found over 100 cases all over the country where pregnant women who needed emergency care were either turned away or treated poorly since 2022. And it was all because of these laws.
Wow. Over 100 cases. That's a lot. And just to be clear, these aren't just women looking for abortions.
I know, not at all. We're talking about women having miscarriages, ectopic pregnancies, situations where their lives are actually on the line. These laws are affecting every pregnant woman, even the ones who want to carry their pregnancies to term.
That really makes you realize this is bigger than just the abortion debate. This is about women's health and their right to get the care they need, period.
Exactly. One case that really sticks out is Candy Miller, another woman from Georgia. She died in November 2022, just a few months after the Life Act went into effect. And she had lupus, diabetes, and hypertension conditions that made pregnancy super risky for her.
And doctors had actually warned her that having another baby could be fatal. But she got pregnant in the fall of 2022. And because the Georgia law doesn't really consider those pre-existing conditions, even though they could become life-threatening later in the pregnancy, she felt like she had to try to get an abortion.
Right. And just like Amber, Candy had to figure all this out by herself. She ordered abortion pills online. But unfortunately, she didn't expel all the fetal tissue, and she ended up needing a D&C.
But then, of course, because of that Life Act, getting that procedure in Georgia was almost impossible.
Exactly. Can you imagine her teenage son having to watch his mother suffer for days because she couldn't get the care she needed? It's heartbreaking.
And it shows just how desperate the situations are that women are being forced into when those safe and legal options are taken away. It seems like these laws are pushing women into these really, really dangerous situations.
Yeah, and the numbers back that up. The AP investigation found these horrible examples of women miscarrying in hospital bathrooms, having septic shock, having to wait in agonizing pain for treatment for ectopic pregnancies. Dr. Dara Cass, who's an emergency medicine physician, put it perfectly. It is increasingly less safe to be pregnant and seeking emergency care in an emergency department.
It's a scary thought that just being pregnant and needing emergency care could put a woman's life at risk because of these laws.
And we're also seeing this concerning trend of healthcare providers leaving states that have these bans, especially OBGYNs. And it's really bad in places like Idaho. It's creating these healthcare deserts where pregnant women have fewer options, and they often have to travel really far to get care.
So it's not just the immediate effects on women's health, but the long-term consequences of losing these qualified doctors, too.
Absolutely. It's like a ripple effect. These laws are impacting the whole healthcare system, and it makes it harder for women to get the care they need, no matter what their situation is.
It almost feels like we're going back in time, to a time when women didn't have the same access to health care or the same control over their own bodies.
Yeah, there's definitely a feeling of that. But it's important to remember that the people who support these laws say they're necessary. They say that the laws have exceptions to protect the life of the mother, and that any bad outcomes are just because people misunderstood or misapplied the law, not the law itself.
Right, like that article we have here from the Washington Examiner. They tried to say that Georgia's Life Act wasn't to blame for Amber's death, and that there was just some confusion about how to use the law.
But saying there was confusion kind of misses the point. The real problem is the vague and confusing language in the law itself. That lack of clarity is what creates the opportunity for misinterpretations and fear. And that's what ultimately leads to these tragic outcomes like what happened to Amber.
And we can't forget about the role of those anti-abortion groups. They often push to keep the law's language vague, and they fight against any attempts to make it clearer, because they say that any clarification would create loopholes and undermine the whole point of the ban.
And it makes you wonder, is it really about protecting life? Or is it about restricting abortion no matter what, even if it means putting women's health and well-being at risk?
This is such a complicated issue, morally and ethically. It makes sense that people have such strong opinions on both sides. But we can't lose sight of what's actually happening because of these laws, especially the impact on women's lives and their ability to make their own decisions about their bodies.
And those decisions are often based on really personal and complicated circumstances. We have another case here from ProPublica Jacely Barnica from Texas. She was 28 years old, and she actually wanted to keep a pregnancy. But at 17 weeks, she started having complications. and it ended up in a miscarriage.
This is a perfect example of how these laws don't just affect women who are looking to have abortions.
Exactly. Sadly, doctors waited for over 40 hours before doing anything. They waited until there was no fetal heartbeat. And it seems pretty likely that this delay was because of those restrictive abortion laws in Texas.
And just 3 days after delivering her stillborn baby, Jacily died from an infection. And the Texas Maternal Mortality Review Committee, just like in Amber's case, said that her death could have been prevented.
These cases, they're like puzzle pieces. Each one shows us another part of how harmful these bans really are. And they all point to a scary trend, a growing threat to women's health and freedom in a world after Roe.
It feels like we're barely scratching the surface here. With all these different stories and these bigger trends coming out, it's pretty obvious that this issue isn't going away anytime soon.
Yeah, and it's changing in ways we couldn't have even imagined just a couple years ago. And one area that's really interesting is how technology is playing a part in all of this.
That's true. On one hand, you have these telehealth services and online platforms like Aid Access. They're working to make abortion care more accessible, especially for women in those states where clinics have had to close down. It's like they're trying to bridge the gap that these restrictive laws have created.
But it's kind of a two-way street because while technology can help bridge that gap, it can also be used for surveillance and even prosecution. We're seeing some states trying to keep tabs on what women are doing online, looking for any sign that they might have bought abortion pills or even just searched for information about abortion.
That's really unsettling.
Yeah.
It feels like a huge invasion of privacy, and it makes you wonder, where do they draw the line? Where does it end?
It brings up so many questions about data security and informed consent and the potential for people to misuse personal information. And this is all happening while anyone who helps someone get an abortion is facing more and more legal risks.
You're talking about those laws that let regular people sue anyone who helps with an abortion, right? Like we saw in Texas with SB 8. That law basically turned everyday citizens into bounty hunters, offering rewards for successful lawsuits. It was all about enforcing that state's 6-week abortion ban.
Exactly. That law made people scared and suspicious of each other. It turned neighbors into informants. It blurred the line between law enforcement and vigilantism. And it raised some serious concerns about the potential for abuse and harassment.
This whole situation is so complex. We've been talking about the immediate effects on women's health and their access to care. But what about the long-term consequences? What kind of impact are we seeing on families, communities, and even society as a whole?
That's where we have to start thinking about the economic, social, and psychological effects. Forcing women to have babies they don't want can have a ripple effect. It can lead to financial problems, especially for those who are already struggling. It can mess up their education and career plans. And then there's the toll it takes on the mental health of women and their families.
It's like a chain reaction. And what about the kids who are born into these situations? Are there enough support systems in place? Are we actually meeting the needs of these families, especially the single mothers who are hit the hardest by these laws?
Those are questions we need to be asking. We have to look beyond just the legal battles and think about the bigger picture. Are we really supporting families? Are we investing in resources and services that can help them thrive? Or are we just forcing births without thinking about what happens in the long run?
This deep dive has been a lot to process. We've talked about so many things, from personal stories that break your heart to complicated legal analysis to new trends in technology. And it's clear that the debate about abortion and reproductive rights is far from settled.
It's an ongoing battle. But I think what gives me hope is that more and more people are becoming aware of this issue. They're asking questions and demanding better from the people in charge.
We started this deep dive with Amber Thurman's story, a young mother whose life was tragically cut short. And her case, along with all the others we've discussed, really shows us the human cost of these restrictive abortion bans. It reminds us that these aren't just abstract legal arguments. They have real consequences that affect real people.
Absolutely. This is about women's lives, their health, their freedom, and their right to make choices about their own bodies and their own futures.
And as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with this. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. This is a fight for reproductive justice, and it needs all of us to be actively involved in shaping the future we want to see.
Don't be afraid to ask tough questions, to challenge what you think you know, and to seek out different perspectives. The more we understand about this complex issue, the better we'll be able to fight for real change.